Check, check. Opposition. Introduction. Certain words in the vocabulary of common speech, used at almost every turn of discourse, indicate ideas so indispensable to human thought that they are often employed without analysis. The word is one of these, signifying the idea of being or existence. The word not and the pair of words either, or have the same character. Taken together, not and either, or, signify the idea of opposition. The quality of redness is not the same as the quality of hotness. Yet this negative relation by itself does not make them opposite, for something can be red hot. It is only when a thing can have either one quality or another, but not both, that the qualities are said to be opposed. Opposites are more than merely distinct. They exclude one another. Opposition seems to be as pervasive as the familiar words which signify it, even if it were not itself one of the great ideas. It would be manifest in all the other basic notions which come in antithetical pairs, e.g., good and evil, life and death, war and peace, universal and particular, pleasure and pain, necessity and contingency, same and other, one and many, virtue and vice. Each of these notions seems to imply its opposite and to draw its meaning from the opposition. There are other terms in the list of great ideas which, though not paired in the same chapter, stand opposed to one another. Art to nature, chance to fate, liberty to slavery, time to eternity, knowledge to opinion, matter to form, democracy to oligarchy, and similarly other forms of government. Still other terms cannot be discussed without reference to their opposites, even though we have not explicitly listed them, such as being and non-being, truth and falsity, love and hate, justice and injustice, wealth and poverty. The enumeration might extend to include every fundamental notion, except for the inconvenience, in certain cases, of not having readily familiar names to designate the opposites. In some instances, moreover, the opposition seems to involve more than a pair of terms, as for example in the case with poetry, history, and science, or physics, mathematics, and metaphysics. In the tradition of the great books, we not only find the opposition of one idea to another, but we also find opposite points of view, conflicting theories or doctrines, in the discussion of almost every basic topic under the heading of these ideas. We find the same word used with contrary meanings, the same proposition affirmed and denied. We find reasoning opposed to reasoning, The same conclusion is reached from apparently opposite principles, or opposite conclusions are drawn from premises apparently the same. But though opposition seems to be inherent in the realm of ideas and in the life of thought, the idea of opposition is not itself explicitly thought about in many of the great books. This does not mean that in the consideration of other matters, the significance and consequences of opposition go unnoted. On the contrary, all the chapters dealing with the nature and conduct of man, or with the institutions and history of society, give evidence of the general recognition by poets and historians, by scientists and philosophers, that opposition in the form of active conflict characterizes the phenomena. The fact of warring opposites not only enters into descriptions of the way things are, but also poses problems for psychologists, moralists, economists, and statesmen to solve. The study of nature, as well as of man and society, discovers opposition at the root of change. The physics of antiquity, for example, defines the elements or the bodily humors in terms of contrary qualities. According to Aristotle, contraries are among the ultimate principles of nature. The terms of change, the cosmology of Lucretius, makes the conflict of opposites the principle of growth and decay in the universe. Destruction struggles against creativity, life against death. The death-dealing motions, the poet writes, cannot keep the mastery always, nor entomb existence forever more. Nor, on the other hand, can the birth and increase-giving motions of things preserve them always after they are born. Thus, the war of first beginnings, waged from eternity, is carried on with dubious issue. Now here, now there, the life-bringing elements of things get the mastery and are overmastered in turn. Modern mechanics deals with action and reaction in the impact of bodies and the resolution of forces tending to produce opposite results. The theory of evolution pictures the world of living organisms as engaged in the struggle for survival, organism competing with organism, or against an adverse environment for the means of subsistence or reproduction. These indications of the prevalence of conflict in the realm of thought itself, or as a fundamental conception in man's thinking about nature and society, do not alter the point that only in logic or metaphysics is opposition abstracted from special subject matters to become itself the object of thought. Even so, not all of the great speculative works develop an explicit theory of opposition, classifying its types, analyzing its structure, formulating it as a universal principle of being, mind, or spirit. Four authors especially treat opposition as a primary theme, though not out of the context of such other notions as being, relation, one and many, same and other, or identity, and difference. They are Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel. It should not be surprising that the same authors are the principal figures in the chapter on dialectic. Their disagreement about the nature or meaning of dialectic has a parallel here in their conflicting theories of opposition. Socrates argues in the Protagoras for the unity of virtue by using the principle that everything has one opposite and not more than one. If wisdom is the opposite of folly, and if it also appears that folly is opposed by temperance, then either wisdom and temperance are the same, or a thing may have more than one opposite. Protagoras reluctantly accepts the first alternative. He is apparently unwilling to reopen the question concerning the pairing of opposites. But the question is reopened by others. It is one of the great problems in the theory of opposition, relevant to the distinction of different kinds of opposites. The problem can most readily be stated in terms of the logical processes of division and definition, on the hypothesis that opposites always come in pairs. Every class can be divided into two subclasses, which not only exclude each other, but also exhaust the membership of the divided class. Such division is called dichotomy. Many of the Platonic dialogues, notably the Sophist and the Statesman, exemplify the method of dichotomous division, used as a device for constructing definitions. The object to be defined, the character of the statesman or the sophist, is finally caught in the net of classification when, division after division having been made, two subclasses are reached which have no other possibilities open. The thing is either one or the other. In the Sophist, a preliminary exercise is undertaken in the method of division as preparation for the use of this method to define the sophist. It will serve us here as an example of dichotomy. All the arts are first divided into two kinds, the productive and the acquisitive. Then the acquisitive arts are divided into those making voluntary exchanges and those which obtain goods by coercion. The coercive divides into fighting and hunting, according to the alternatives of open or secret attack, hunting into the hunting of the lifeless and the living, hunting of the living into hunting of swimming or walking animals, the hunting of swimming animals into the hunting of winged animals, and the hunting of water animals, the hunting of water animals into opposite methods of catching fish, with further subdivisions made until the art of angling can be defined as an acquisitive art, which, being coercive, is a form of hunting, distinguished from other forms of hunting by the character of its object, animals which swim in water rather than air, and by the method used to catch them, hooks or barbs rather than nets or baskets. Aristotle objects to the process of division, this process of division, as a way of defining things. Some writers, he says, propose to reach the definitions of the ultimate forms of life, animal life, by bipartite division. But this method is often difficult and often impractical. For one thing, it tends to associate or dissociate natural groups arbitrarily, e.g. the classification of birds with water animals, or of some birds with fish and some birds with land animals. If such natural groups are not to be broken up, the method of dichotomy cannot be employed, for it necessarily involves such breaking up and dislocation. Aristotle also calls attention to the fact that the method of dichotomy often uses negative terms in order to make an exhaustive division into two and only two subclasses. But the class which is formed by negative characterization cannot be further subdivided. There can be no specific forms of a negation, of featherless, for instance, or of footless, as there are of feathered and of footed. It is impossible, Aristotle says, to get at the ultimate specific forms of animal life by bifurcate division. He therefore proposes a method of defining by genus and difference, according to which it is possible in biological classification to subdivide a genus into more than two species, to avoid subdivision into two and only two, that which differentiates each species from the others within the same genus must be some positive characteristic. As alternative methods of definition, dichotomous division, and the differentiation of species within a genus are discussed in the chapter on definition. Here we are concerned with the problem of the number of opposites produced by the exhaustive division of a class or kind. For example, how many species of color are there? If the primary colors are more than two, it would appear that each primary color has more than one opposite, since the same object at the same time and in the same respect cannot be both red and yellow, red and green, green and yellow. But Aristotle seems to restrict the notion of contrariety to pairs of opposite qualities, red, yellow, and such colors. Although qualities have no contraries, he says, whether or not he would have regarded them as contraries if he had been acquainted with the chromatic series of the spectrum remains a conjecture. To find a single opposite for red, it is necessary to employ the negative term not red. But then another difficulty arises, which Aristotle recognizes when he calls the negative term indefinite, and which Kant discusses when he treats the infinity of the negative. The not red includes more than other colors which are not red, such as green and yellow. It includes everything in the universe, colored or colorless, which is not red, e.g. happiness or atoms or poetry. perfect dichotomy can be achieved by using positive and negative terms as opposites, or what Aristotle sometimes calls contradictory terms, such as man and not man, or just and not just. But the class which is thus divided is absolutely indeterminate. It is the universe, everything, the infinite. It is necessary, furthermore, to distinguish between the opposition of just and not just, and the opposition of just and unjust. The term unjust is the contrary, rather than the contradictory, of just. For these opposites apply only to men, or laws, or acts. Only certain kinds of things are either just or unjust. The term unjust is the contrary, rather than the contradictory, of just. For these opposites apply only to men, or laws, or acts. Only certain kinds of things are either just or unjust, and that is why it is said that contraries are always opposites within a genus, or a definite kind. In contrast, not just is the contradictory, rather than the contrary, of just. For these opposites apply to everything in the universe. Everything is either the kind of thing to which just and unjust apply, or it is the kind of thing to which neither of these terms apply. And so it is the not just. In addition to separating contraries, both of which are positive terms, from contradictory opposites, one of which is a positive, the other a negative term, Aristotle distinguishes two sorts of contraries. On the one hand, such contraries as odd and even exhaustively divide a limited class, e.g., integral numbers. On the other hand, such contraries as white and black represent the extremes of a continuous series of shades, in which any degree of grayness can be considered as the opposite of either extreme or of a darker or a lighter gray. There are still other kinds of opposite pairs, according to Aristotle, such as the terms double and half, which have the peculiarity of implying each other, or the terms blindness and sight, which are opposite conditions of the same subject. In the last case, one of the opposites naturally belongs to a certain kind of thing, and the other represents a loss of that natural property or trait. It is therefore called a privation. Considering these various modes of opposition, Aristotle proposes a fourfold classification of opposite terms. Correlative opposites, like double and half, contrary opposites, like odd and even, white and black, just and unjust, the opposites of possession and privation, such as sight and blindness, the opposites of affirmation and negation, such as man and not man, or just and not just. He discusses the special characteristics of each type of opposition, but it is only contrariety which he thinks requires further subdivision. Even though both are always positive terms, some contraries, like odd and even, exhaust a definite class, just as positive and negative opposites exhaust the infinite. They admit of no intermediate terms, and hence they differ from contraries like white and black. White and black are extreme limits of a continuous series and thus permit an indefinite number of intermediates which fall between them. Things which differ only in degree are like the sort of contraries which find their place in a continuous series. Things which differ in kind are like the sort of contraries between which no intermediates are possible. One of the great problems of classification, especially with respect to living organisms, is whether the diverse species which fall within a single genus differ in kind or only in degree. The answer would seem to depend on whether the several species are related by one or the other sort of contrariety. As the chapter on evolution indicates, the basic meaning of the word species changes when the possibility of intermediate forms is rejected or admitted. When a class is divided by contraries without intermediates, the genus can have only two species, as for example the division of animals into brutes and men. When a genus is divided into more than two subclasses, e.g. the division of vertebrates into fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, it would seem to follow that the species are like points in a continuous series and admit the possibility of intermediate types. According to Darwin's conception of species, their contrariety always tends to take the latter form. Aristotle, on the other hand, seems to use the word species in two distinct senses, which correspond to the two kinds of contrariety, with and without intermediates. A thing's difference from that from which it differs in species, he writes, must be a contrariety. But though contrariety is always a complete difference, the fact that contrarieties are so called in several senses leads him to observe that their modes of completeness will answer to the various modes of contrariety which attach to the contraries. The logical opposition of propositions or judgments depends in part on the opposition of terms or concepts. If contrary things are said about the same subject of discourse, i.e., if the same number is called odd and even, or the same act is called cowardly and courageous, or the same animal is called a bird and a mammal, pairs of contrary statements are made, of which both cannot be true. But it does not seem to follow that one of the two statements must be true. Both can be false. In the examples given, the number may be a fraction, and neither odd nor even. The act may be foolhardy, and neither courageous nor cowardly. The animal may be a reptile, and neither bird nor mammal. This characteristic of contrary statements, the impossibility of their both being true combined with the possibility of their both being false, can also be found, according to Aristotle, in propositions which have the same subject and do not contain contrary terms as predicates. The propositions "all men are white" and "no men are white" cannot both be true, but they can both be false. The contrariety of these two statements, which can be taken as typifying the opposition of all universal affirmations and negations, does not depend on contrary predicates, but on the opposed meanings of all are and none is. All are and none is. Keeping the terms constant and varying only the quality and quantity of the propositions, Aristotle formulates two other typical modes of opposition between pairs of statements. When both statements are particular or limited, but one is affirmative and the other negative, both cannot be false, though both can be true. E.g., some men are white and some men are not white. This pair of opposites Aristotle calls subcontraries. When one statement is universal and affirmative, and the other is particular and negative, or when one is universal and negative, the other particular and affirmative, the two propositions are, according to Aristotle, contradictory. Contradiction is the most complete type of opposition, for contradictory statements are opposite in both quality and quantity. Of a pair of contradictories, both cannot be true and both cannot be false. One must be true and the other false. E.g., it must be true either that all men are white or that some men are not white. The formal scheme of opposite statements, traditionally known as the square of opposition, appears to exhaust all possibilities. It indicates, moreover, that every statement may have two opposites, a contradictory and either a contrary or a subcontrary. For example, all men are white is contradicted by some men are not white, and opposed in a merely contradictory fashion by no men are white. The latter is a weaker form of opposition, since it permits the dilemma to be avoided by the truth of a third statement, that some men are white and some are not. The dilemma set up by contradiction cannot be avoided in this way. The propositions God exists and God does not exist, or the world had a beginning and the world did not have a beginning, constitute contradictions from which there seem to be no escape. It would seem to make a difference, therefore, in facing the great controversies in the tradition of Western thought, to know whether the opposite views which men have taken on fundamental issues are genuine contradictions, requiring everyone to take sides, or whether they are merely contrary positions. In the latter alternative, the inconsistency of the theories prevents us from agreeing with both parties to the dispute, but it does not require us to agree with either. For contrary doctrines never exhaust the possibilities. Between such extreme positions, for example, as that everything is in flux and nothing changes, both of which cannot be true, the truth may lie in the doctrine that some elements of permanence are involved in all change, or it may be in the theory of a realm of becoming that lacks permanence, and a realm of being that is free from change. One of the basic controversies in the tradition of the great books concerns opposition itself. Is the principle of contradiction the ultimate test of the truth of judgments and reasoning? Is the truth of indemonstrable propositions or axioms certified by the self-contradiction of their contradictories? For example, is the truth of the proposition the whole is greater than the part made necessary by the impossibility of the contradictory statement, the whole is not greater than the part, on the theory that this latter statement is impossible because it is self-contradictory? And when a conclusion is demonstrated by propositions which seem to be necessarily true, must not the contradictory of this conclusion be false, or at least be incapable of demonstration by propositions which are also necessarily true? On both these questions, Kant and Aristotle seem to be opposed. According to Aristotle, no truths are necessary or axiomatic unless their contradictories are self-contradictory. But Kant makes a distinction between analytical and synthetical propositions discussed in the chapter on judgment. And in terms of it, he restricts the principle of contradiction to serving as a criterion of truth for analytical judgments alone. In an analytical judgment, he writes, whether negative or affirmative, its truth can always be tested by the principle of contradiction. But though we must admit, Kant continues, that the principle of contradiction is the general and altogether sufficient principle of all analytical knowledge. Beyond this, its authority and utility as a sufficient criterion of truth must not be allowed to extend. In the synthetical part of our knowledge, we must, no doubt, take great care never to offend against that inviolable principle, but we ought never to expect from it any help with regard to the truth of this kind of knowledge. The reason Kant explains is that in forming an analytical judgment, I remain within a given concept while predicating something of it. If what I predicate is affirmative, I only predicate of that concept what is already contained in it. If it is negative, I only exclude from it the opposite of it. For example, if the meaning of the concept whole involves being greater than a part, self-contradiction results from denying that the whole is greater than a part. In forming synthetical judgments, on the contrary, I have to go beyond a given concept in order to bring something together with it, which is totally different from what is contained in it. Here Kant declares we have neither the relation of identity nor of contradiction, and nothing in the judgment itself by which we can discover is truth or its falsehood, its truth or its falsehood. For example, the judgment that everything which happens has a cause. The truth of such synthetical judgments, according to Kant, is as necessary and as a priori as the truth of analytical judgments. But the principle of contradiction does not provide that ground or validation. For Aristotle, in contrast, those propositions which do not derive necessity from the principle of contradiction belong to the sphere of opinion rather than to the domain of knowledge. They can be asserted as probable only, not as true or false. In the domain of knowledge, it is impossible to construct valid arguments for contradictory conclusions. For if one must be true and the other false, one can be validly demonstrated and the other cannot be demonstrated at all. But in the sphere of opinion, dialectical opposition is possible. Because the contradictory of a probable statement is itself also probable, probable arguments can be constructed on the opposite sides of every dialectical issue. For Kant, dialectical issues do not consist in a conflict of opposed probabilities. Far from setting probable reasoning against probable reasoning, dialectical opposition consists in what appear to be demonstrations of contradictory propositions. For example, in that part of the Critique of Pure Reason devoted to the transcendental dialectic, Kant presents opposed arguments which look like demonstrations of contradictory propositions, such as the thesis that the world has a beginning in time, and its antithesis that the world has no beginning, or the thesis that there exists an absolutely necessary being, and its antithesis that there nowhere exists an absolutely necessary being. There are two of the four issues which Kant calls the antinomies of a transcendental dialectic. Such issues, Aristotle would agree with Kant, do not belong to the sphere of opinion or probability. But Kant would not agree with Aristotle that such issues belong to the domain of science or certain knowledge. The problem of the world's beginning or eternity, for example, is one which Aristotle treats in his Physics, and appears to think is solved by the demonstration that motion can have neither beginning nor end. The problem of the existence of a necessary being is one which Aristotle treats in his Metaphysics, and which he also appears to think is capable of a demonstrative solution. For him, therefore, both are problems to which scientific answers can be given. But for Kant, the demonstration of the antithesis or contradictory propositions in both cases is as cogent as the demonstrations of the theses. And therefore, since we know that both of a pair of contradictory propositions cannot be validly demonstrated, we must conclude that the arguments advanced are only counterfeit demonstrations, or as Kant says, illusory. He calls these demonstrations dialectical, and the issues they attempt to resolve antinomies, precisely because he thinks the reasoning goes beyond the limits of scientific thought, and because he thinks the issues are problems reason cannot ever solve. With respect to conclusions, affirming or denying matters beyond experience, the antinomies can be interpreted either as showing that contradictory arguments are equally sound, or as showing that they are equally faulty. On either interpretation, Kant and Aristotle seem to be opposed on the applicability of the principle of contradiction to conflicting arguments and conclusions, except of course those which are merely probable. This difference between them accords with the difference in their conceptions of science and dialectic, and in their theories of the scope and the conditions of valid knowledge. The opposition between Kant and Aristotle may not present the only alternatives. Hegel's theory of the dialectical process seems to offer a third, where Aristotle appears to think that all contradictions must be resolved in favor of one of the opposites, and where Kant appears to think that some contradictions cannot be resolved at all, Hegel proposes the resolution of all contradictions, not by a choice between them, but by synthesis uniting the opposites and reconciling their differences. According to Aristotle, opposites exclude one another in existence as well as in thought. A thing cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. Nor, in any particular respect, can it simultaneously both be and not be of a certain sort. Only with the passage of time and in the course of change can opposites be realized. When a thing passes from being to non-being, or gives up one attribute in order to assume its contrary. The difference for Aristotle between becoming and being, or between change and complete actuality, seems to be that the one includes and the other excludes opposites. Change cannot occur except as one opposite comes into existence while the other passes away. But opposites cannot coexist with complete actuality. So far as reality consists of coexistent actualities, it is limited by the principle of contradiction, as a principle of being to those which are not contradictory. All possibilities cannot therefore be simultaneously realized, for as Leibniz states the principle, all possibilities are not compossible. According to Hegel, every finite phase of reality, everything except the absolute idea itself, has its contradictory as real as itself and coexistent with it. Contradictories imply one another and require each other, almost as correlative opposites do. Whatever is partial and incomplete presupposes something which is partial and incomplete in an opposite respect. The opposition between them can therefore be overcome by a synthesis which includes them both, and which complements each by uniting it with the other. For example, the category of being is opposed by non-being. These opposites both exclude and imply one another. They are, in a sense, even identical with one another, insofar as the notion of being contains the notion of non-being, and conversely, the notion of non-being, the notion of being. Except for the absolute, everything which is also is not, and everything which is not also is. The apparent contradiction involved in this simultaneous application of opposite categories to the same thing is overcome by a third category, becoming, which is the synthesis of being and non-being. Being and non-being are united in becoming. This reconciling of opposites by their union in a more inclusive whole, embracing both, typifies the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The motion repeats itself as the synthesis of one contradiction faces its own opposite and requires a higher synthesis to overcome the contradiction it has generated. Thus, every opposition in reality or thought is a phase in the progressive realization of the absolute, wherein all contradictions are resolved. In Hegel's philosophy of history and in his theory of the development of the state and the philosophy of right, the dialectical process is exemplified at every stage of progress. The conflict of interdependent opposites, of opposite classes or forces in society, of opposite political institutions and principles, calls for a resolution which shall unite rather than exclude the opposites. Considering the division of labor, for example, Hegel writes, "When men are dependent on one another and reciprocally related in their work and the satisfaction of their needs, subjective self-seeking turns into a contribution to the satisfaction of the needs of everyone else." That is to say, a dialectical advance, subjective self-seeking turns into the mediation of the particular through the universal, with the result that each man is earning, producing, and enjoying on his own account, is eo ipso producing and earning for the enjoyment of everyone else. The opposition between the particular good of each individual and the universal good of all is thus overcome by that advance in social organization, which is the division of labor. Each of the stages of world history is, according to Hegel, the presence of a necessary moment in the idea of the world mind. But the world mind itself is a synthesis, a resolution of the conflicting opposites of the various national minds, which are wholly restricted on account of their particularity. Their deeds and destinies in the their reciprocal relations to one another are the dialectic of the finitude of these minds, and out of it arises the universal mind, the mind of the world, free from all the restrictions, producing itself as that which exercises its right. And its right is the highest right of all over these finite minds in the history of the world, which is the world's court of judgment. All right. I wonder sometimes if all of this philosophical reasoning and whatnot, if it actually is just reinforcing illusory concepts, things that appear to be the case on the surface, or, just at first glance. are actually not real. Kind of like I guess that's the skeptic mindset, that you can't really say anything is an axiom. Because, I keep saying, you have someone like Jesus come along who does all this stuff that's supposed to be impossible. And it's just like, yeah, sure, I mean, there's no rules. I'm just like, what? So it makes me wonder if because these philosophers, they put terms and definitions to every sort of motion of the mind that seems to occur. Every attempt the human mind seems to make at understanding reality. There's words for. But they aren't necessarily like correct notions. They might just be the beginnings of understanding. The very beginnings. Just a faint echo of reality. People seem to take pride in their mindset of being like a realist. Like, oh, I only believe what, is plainly observable. And you'd have to like show me all sorts of experiments and proof to like get me to believe anything that isn't totally obvious up front. And I think it's kind of a silly way to think, because it's like, well, how do you explain that anything exists at all in the first place? Is that not miraculous? Just people of little faith. That's what Christ was always calling everyone else. Ye of little faith. I wonder what that is in human beings that makes us like that. Just a lack of imagination, maybe. Sort of probably a resentment of the realities of life, starting out as a child and believing in anything and everything, and then being faced with the cruel, harsh realities of life and sort of resenting that. It's probably what it is.